Disclaimer. The information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
Thank you, everybody, and welcome to another aspect of the show here. And let's see how we're doing here. So, do I have to? Oh, actually, I do not have to. This is the Kish Foundation American Knowledge Team meeting on Sunday. And let's see, I do have to share. Here we go. This is the Kish Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. We're going to be discussing the Advanced Inner Space Review. My name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It is November. It's actually November the 12th, ladies and gentlemen. So sorry. And this is the Kish Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So we are doing this for the benefit of our teachers who have been with us, as we see, over a decade. But there have been other teachers who've been with us for eternity. And so we really have to understand the limitations of man-made laws versus the unlimitations of the universal role of man and the universal laws. And so how they relate. And so we're at a very pivotal point here because we know there's a lot of people who are hesitant about understanding the plasma science. The physicality is so warm and fuzzy sometimes, but it also is the lowest energy state. And so what we're trying to do is to help the mature knowledge seekers and also provide an opportunity for the new knowledge seekers to have the same gifts and opportunities that we have had, starting with book number 1 by Maren Tevel Kodekesh, The Universal Order, Creation of Matter. And then we want to discuss the book number 2, The Structure of the Light, and then, of course, book number 3, The Origin of the Universe, which is a bit of a problem, isn't it? Because if the origin is the beginning, then how come it's book number 3? And so this is the kind of thing that we have to understand, how we navigate through this plasma highway, because we're all searching for outer space. We think we know what it is. We keep talking about it. But what it really is the embodiment of our little piece of pie in the sky. And so we're looking at all these kinds of embodiments. So we have donkeys, and then maybe we have horses or camels, maybe plasma vehicles, enhancement units, or maybe just walking. Or of course, there's always the submarines, and then there are the supermarines, which are really aircraft, satellites, and then spaceships and all sorts of other things. So where does this plasma science and plasma highway begin? And so we've been starting since December the 16th of 2022 to hold special monthly classes to introduce the concept of transmutation. And so please remember that on Friday, November the 24th, there will be another class where we will try to engage with the transmutation of light. So this is just another step in the evolution and the teaching process for us to understand what we have already accomplished with the cups of life, because it's exactly the same, except it's on a different energy level. With the cups of life, we started with physicality and we did nanocoding, and we created GANs. And we had a purpose for that. But where did all that come from? And so we did cover our Earth space, and now we're at the conclusion of our inner space. And this is the advanced portion of the inner space, which is a continuation of all the teachings that have been going on for the last 4 years. And this is the conclusion of the inner space advanced teachings. And as you can see, this is a review of what already went a few months ago, starting in February, with the sweetheart, the emotion of vision, the emotion of knowledge, the soul family, soul of inertia, and dream memory, because we're still searching for our outer space sentimental pie in the sky. And the key to this, of course, is that our soul is looking for the source and the link to that source, because we see that we are on this planet, and this planet has a special positioning. It's location specific, but it's not the only planet in the solar system. So each planet seems to have its own position, and that position is different from the other planet, and these positions do not cross over. So the position is different, the orbit is different, the shape is different, even the rotation is different. The only thing that is common is that they're all planets, they're all in the solar system, and they all rotate or orbit around the sun. And we've chosen one of them. So the one that we've chosen is the one we haven't excluded from what we haven't chosen. In other words, we haven't chosen any of the others. And so to know which one we chose, we had to look at our neighbors and see, well, we didn't choose them. And so what was left over, it was Earth. So is Earth just a leftover, or what is it? And so when we look at the relationships of different dimensions, and we see that 1 and 1 is greater than 2. And so the 1 being the feeding dimensions and the product being the 2, but it's not specifically 2, it's 2 or more. And the reason for that is because the 1 is not the same 1 as the other 1. 1 cannot be the same as the other 1. This is the reality of the plasma science. And so when we create the 3rd dimension, likewise, we don't lose the first 2 dimensions. So in fact, the 2 feeding dimensions continue feeding, because if they stop feeding, then the 3rd dimension will never be a product. So the 3 dimensions work together, and they're all feedback dimensions. because in order for the feeding dimensions to continue feeding, the product has to feed back that it wants to be fed. And so when we get that feedback, the feeding dimensions then continue the feeding, and that feeding becomes the feedback to the product. That's just the way it is. And so we're the observers. And we're trying to understand this pi, which is 3.14 and a bit, and a bit, and a bit, and a bit, which, we'll just fudge that over. But we're in that dimension because we're observing those other three dimensions. So we're in the fourth dimension. Well, where are we? If we're going to be somewhere, that somewhere has to be there. And so the three feedback dimensions not only feed back to themselves internally, but feed back to us so that we can adopt them as our part of the dimensions. So by being the fourth dimension, we complete the star formation. But you see, the thing is that in order to establish this positioning, there is this specific location. And so this information is broadcast. And we have tuned into that channel. And we tuned in before we saw it. But the problem is, you see, is that the broadcast is all over. And all we seem to be satisfied with is that just that little piece of pie. Because not only is it kind of warm and fuzzy for us as a home, but it's also sweet. And that's our little sweetheart pie. And that's what we want to discuss today, because you see, the speed of light has to do with the distance and time. But, if the distance is measured in light years, then different distances fail in terms of reference. Because there are more life years than there is in our existence. So really, what we're looking at with terms of our reference is we're so happy with our existence, which is our landing point, Earth, and then the space around it, which is our near space. But then there's also far space. And so that's not within our field of reference, is it? And if it's not in our field of reference, then the question is there a guiding hand to make that field of reference? So which reference is, the one that you want to look at? So this becomes a real problem for us, because there's nothing that we can review on this. These are uncharted skies. So we are pioneers, in fact. And so who wants to lead the pack? And on what criteria do you want to do that? So students obviously follow the teacher, but, in this case, the teacher becomes the student. So what we have to follow is the moral leader. We have to have faith in that leader. And that faith has to be unconditional. But it doesn't have to be irresponsible, okay? Because there's more to just listening to the leader or seeing what we're doing. We have to make default positioning choices so that we can sort it out. And in order to sort it out, we have to get elevated, because otherwise we're really going to feel the bumps in the rough road ahead. And so we say, well, we tune it in and turn it on and drop out. And that was a very favorite phrase for me personally when I was a youth. because of the drug culture connotations. It was just our way of being rebellious towards the society, because we could clearly see objectively as observers that the society that was constructed in the three dimensions that was presented to us was not fulfilling. And so that fourth dimension, that fulfillment, was absent. And since that affected us, then, we were not satisfied. So how do we cope with it? But we didn't understand that we wanted to tune in to the power of the universe and turn on to that connection. But in order to do that, we had to drop out. But what did we have to drop out of? So some said to drop out of society. But what we have to drop out of is our physicality. Because we actually dropped into our physicality. See, because the message really is that our physicality is working in the background. That's why we have to drop out of this physicality focus. The soul is operating in the foreground, but we think it's operating in the background. So this becomes a challenge. How do we drop out of our physical domination and understand that the physicality is working in the background at all the times? Because in the beginning, there were no planets, no atmosphere, no water. In fact, there was kind of nothingness. And yet, we want to say, well, okay, I'm here. Well, where exactly are you? You just seem to be someplace. Well, so there has to be a place, right? And so the sun came before the planet came, right? So before the planet could orient itself and find its position in the sky, it had to have the sun to come to it. So the sun is the source of energy for the solar system. And of course, it was created from the universe. So how is the universe created? Well, it's created the same way. It exists from energy. And since this energy is always in motion, then we have to understand that it works in combination. And so to determine which thing it is working in combination with, we have to determine its charge. And so as we bring things that have a common denominator together, as we see in the cover of book number 1, we bring the universal order of creation of matters together, where we bring in 3 different energy fields of matter, dark matter, and antimatter. And that creates a Magravh condition. So that becomes the focal point of what? What is the source? And so the source could be something on the same energy level, or it could be something on a different energy level. And that different energy level could be higher or lower. So, in fact, when we look at all things in combination, we have to take into consideration that if the obvious is not available, then we have to figure out and understand that there's something working in the background. And so we say, well, in the foreground is our physicality. Well, no, our physicality is the product of what's been going on in our so-called background. So therefore, it's our background is the foreground, and our physicality is the background. This is what we have to understand, because the plasma interaction is the Magravh condition. So when we look at the infinity loop and we see how all things are working in combination, where we have a magnetical pushing and a gravitational pulling, and then we have this crossover in between. So that's your basic plasma interaction. And so each of the planets did the same thing. They all followed one by one. But the thing is, of course, that's all we're focusing on is the physicality. The rest of it is kind of, well, it's just there, isn't it? So then came the whole train. Mercury, then Venus, then the Earth, then Mars, Then there was this other planet we call Tiamat, which legend says was there, but was blasted to smithereens by an argument that some people had, and it caused a nuclear explosion. But the reality that we discovered is that outer space is not a place. Outer space is a method of energy transfer. Outer space is this energy in motion. And so this is the connection, because we are now at this landing point on Earth space. So if we have this landing point, then at some point we had a launch point, and we don't know where that was. And we don't know how we got here, but we got through some space. Well, that space was the reality dimension, because that's what we operate in. So to understand where we operate, we have to understand that there's a plasmatic reality, and that plasmatic reality has references. And so when those two references come together and create the third dimension, that becomes your McGrath condition of a balanced condition. But that balanced position is invisible. It isn't until we materialize into the physical reality that it becomes visible. And then we have to understand that in its physical reality, it has to be maintained, you see. So the physical reality becomes the product in the physical reality. And to be maintained in the physical reality, it has to be fed by the plasmatic reality reference fields. So this plasmatic reference fields maintain the physicality in this energy state. But we have to understand that when we say the plasmatic reality, we're not saying which energy state, because there are many different energy states, and that's the point. So when we look at our man space and we say, oh, you know, we just have our body that's in the physical matter state, and our body is on the earth body, which is in a physical matter state. But that is the product. And that is the product of the dynamic interaction of the soul of the man and the soul of the body. And what is the conveyance means of transferring this energy? And so we found with the cups of life that it has to do with emotion. And with the cups of life, we have this nano state and we have this Gans state. And to understand this, we have to understand the nature of the cells in our body, you see, because our body is comprised of a bunch of cells, over 70 trillion of them. And each cell has a soul. So we really have to be well organized. And, you know, when we look at our physical space, we can question ourselves as to how well organized we are. And remember that when we question ourselves, we're questioning ourselves with the organization system of the plasma physical body. So plasma, by definition, is a kind of energy state. And there are different kinds of energy state. So the lowest one is our earth space. What we're talking about today is trying to find our inner space, because this is the key to the gateway to the outer space. And this is the whole point of life, isn't it? And this is what's important. And of course, if that's not important, well, then forget about it. So when we're looking at how we create a field, the strength of that field manifests from rotation. So the speed of rotation affects the field strength. And so the important part is that the higher energy state feeds the lower energy state. So we have to have a reference. And so this speed of relation comes into play because these field relations have to be accommodated for. And so we use the higher energy state versus the lower energy state as a strength accommodation process. And so energy states can change, and they can transcend multiple energy states. And they do this by an order of magnitude. So yes, this earth space is a kind of energy state, But the plasma in science is bound to the ethos of the universe. So there are a different set of rules. So there's a different set of relationships that we have to take into account. So plasmatically speaking, we want to take a mag-grav balanced position by balancing off the magnetic and gravitational field forces. But when we look at our scientific relationships, we have the physical scientific responsibility, which has to do with the conservation of energy. And then we have the spiritual responsibility where, well, that's trying to control the spirit, which is the motor of the soul. That's not a balance. That's 1 + 1. So we see the synergy coming with the plasma science because it adds to the knowledge. So if we say the scientific responsibility is 1 and the spiritual responsibility is 1, not the same one, the different one, but they come together and they create more than 2, because you still have the first 2, but with the plasma science, it adds more to that knowledge. And so the question that we are faced with is, it will affect the rate of change, but what is that rate of change? And can we change the rate? So this has to be with our understanding of these field relationships. And most of the time we look at adversarial relationships like the spider versus the fly. And then we have, competition in our coexistence. So we can look at that in the nanotechnology as the awake state being the nanostate, because it's a physical state. And so that's kind of representative of our Earth space. But then we could look at the dream state, which is the gap in the nano state, right? And that becomes our inner space. And so when these two come together, 1 + 1, not the same one, but we bring the plasma science, and this is where it meets the soul of the man, but for peace, because those are the new rules. Well, they're not new rules. We just have to understand them, because we impose limitations on our soul. And so when we look at our presence, we have an emotional attachment to that. And that emotional attachment stems from the emotion of the past. And we just assume that we can take the emotion of the past and apply it to the emotion of the future. Generally speaking, that's true. But it isn't a straight line interaction, because we're all independent variables. So we've all gone through the same process, but we've all arrived at different conclusions in different places. We've all gone through a different transformation at a different rate. And this is all based on the feeding from the sun and the feedback from the earth. And this creates our environment, which is the inertia field that we operate in, and we trust it. That's why we were born. We trust this inertia field. But we all have different degrees of trust. And so we all have a variability in trust, and we're independent in making the choice and how much trust we can impart to it. And so this becomes very, very important, because there are many conditions on this planet that you can trust to not be very trustworthy. And so people who don't understand this, they like to double cross you, and not understanding that that is the cross, that is the actual cross, and it's their eternal burden. Because what they're doing is now drawing energy from the lowest energy state. So when we look at energy in motion and we see that it's positive or negative, where the negative gives and the positive takes, then, the higher the negative charge, the higher the surface to volume ratio of the negative charge. And so that affects the field strength of the energy. And regardless of field strength, it can be binding or flowing. So when we're talking about binding, well, it has to be binding, right? Because in order to be somewhere, you will have to have this mag-grav condition. So that energy has to be binding. And if you want to come from somewhere, or the energy is in motion, it has to come from another source, which has already gone through a binding. It has to be bound in an energy field in order to be in existence. And so for you to draw that energy as a flowing, it has to flow from another binding. And so that binding energy flows to you and you're binding. But your binding from there flows back to that other binding. So this energy is always in motion, and it's a two-way street. And so the both are working together, the binding and the flowing. And this is very important because we need to exist in this binding field. But one of those binding fields is the physical field, and the other binding fields are in the plasmatic field. And so that binding energy in the plasmatic field is unconditional. The binding of the energy in the physical field is at the expense of others. And this doesn't really make sense, does it? Because if you're binding energy from the plasmatic field, that energy is worth orders of magnitude in higher field strength. And so why would we make the choice to draw energy from the weakest, the physicality of someone else who also has the same option that we do? So we were literally depleting the energy that someone else has gathered. Well, that doesn't make any sense. But what it does do is it segregates our soul vision from the point of transformation to what we call the physical transportation. And so our focal point becomes slightly shifted so that we can't see the soul of the man and the soul of the body. This becomes the soul vision that was part of our manifestation. The only thing that we can see is the vision from our soul of the physicality around us. And that's all we take into account. So we become very limited in terms of our soul vision. So to understand the plasma science, we have to understand the nature of the energy flowing and how it still fulfills our binding requirement for being self-serving. But the benefit comes when we're self-serving at the enhancement of others, because when we're drawing the energy from others, if they are doing it graciously, they're not giving from their physicality, they're giving from their soul. And that soul energy is on a plasmatic level. So in order for us to gather that energy, it would be to our benefit to give that energy on that same level. And so that way the energy becomes binding and it becomes flowing and it becomes transferred at a higher energy state. And so these are the plasma rules, you see. And so we've seen this happen because in our emotional affinity to Earth, we're in the biosphere range, right? So this is the range that we operate in. But clearly we can see that when we look at the zinc GANs and the CO2 GANs, we say, oh, well, they're both white, but they're a different kind of white. So we can tell the difference. But that GANs is created and held in a physical bottle, which is transparent. So we can see the GANs inside the bottle, and we can see the water. And the water is also transparent. And then there's a hole in the GANs, and it too is transparent. So we have the physicality, which is transparent. We have the liquid, which is transparent. Then we have the plasma energy, and it too is transparent. And so the only evidence that we have is the feedback that we get. And we see that is kind of circular, indicating a rotating feedback. And so the one feedback works with the other feedback. And so the rotating feedback is a feeding byproduct. It's a process of a process. And we see that in the physical state. And another thing that we see in the physical state is with the X-rays, is we see the gravitational field effect, which is in fact the manifestation of the physicality is the materialization effect, right? And so when we're born, there's an interesting anomaly is with the heart materialization precedes the brain materialization. And then there's the blood materialization. And so the blood materialization flows throughout the body. But when it comes to the brain, it encircles the brain. And so this is what we see in an X-ray. When we look at the materialization, we can see the heart in its physicality. And we can see that first. And then as the fetus grows, then we can see the rest. But at the point where there is no brain, then we wonder how we can communicate. So this becomes a communication stability because we know that we can grow from that point. And so it's an unseen communication stability where we have the heart, but we don't have the brain. And then we grow cells, and these cells have a gravitational stability. And from there, we grow the rest of the body. So by definition, when we look at the difference between the growth, a healthy growth and a cancerous growth, one has a gravitational stability and one has the disruption of stability. That's the difference. But for us, what we want to do is understand how come we can't remember before we were born? Because, you know, we were unborn. But then we can't remember after we were born either. So the only difference is once we're unborn and now we're born, but we still can't remember. And, you know, some of us have trouble just remembering what we did yesterday. We say, oh, we're absent-minded. But what happened if they can't remember after a head injury? And if that head injury is extremely serious, then they become comatose. Well, some people are walking around comatose, totally oblivious to what else is going on around them as well. But that's another comment. There are people who cannot remember, and we attribute it to being aged. They call it Alzheimer's. Then there's another group that can't remember the dreams. So we say they have amnesia. So anytime you can't remember, this is amnesia. And this amnesia is a commentary on the brain function. So since the heart materializes before the brain, then we have to wonder, hey, sweetheart, you remember me? So this is the same problem we have when we go to sleep, because, you know, how do we maintain this dream connection, you know, because we need rest. So who's leaving? Well, obviously the body has to stay behind. And so if the body is staying behind, well, who's minding the fort? And if the brain is still in the fort, then who's minding the brain? So these become the questions we have on how we maintain these dream connections. And while we're having these dreams, our cells are still healing, growing, repairing. They're all still having gravitational stability. And they're always exchanging energy. And that energy is always transitioning from outside the cell to inside the cell, and then back. The energy flows in two ways, from the inside to the outside. And so this is done automatically. And, we don't really need the brain to facilitate the protein because we already facilitated a protein before we even had a brain. And so we find that the building blocks are the amino acids, and three are the foundation. A fourth amino acid causes us to fold over and make protein. And in the process of making this protein, the byproduct is water, H2O. And at that point, we have gravitational stability, or, what we call our physicality. So this energy exchange is going through a sequencing process, which we call the Krebs cycle, which has different energy fields we call cytochrome A, cytochrome B, and cytochrome C, which is kind of like our three energy fields of transition, transmission, and transmutation. And there's a result, although a different energy strengths, the result is the same. Each energy field produces 12 adenosine triphosphate. ATP is the currency of life. And so we need all 36. 36 ATP creates a healthy cell conditioning. But, if we change this sequence, we find there's a deficiency, and it's created deficiency right in the center. Isn't that kind of interesting, right? So there's a feeding and there's a feedback, and it's not working. We're only getting 26 ATP. So we're short about 10 ATP, and that causes an unhealthy cell conditioning. So what is most important is the metabolism rate. So metabolism is to cast out. And so we have an aerobic metabolism, which is has an affinity for a healthy cell. And then we have an anaerobic, or lack of oxygen metabolism, in an unhealthy cell. So this is what we're saying, and there's a reference to oxygen. And what impacts the oxygen is the sweetness. But there's a certain kind of sweetness. So the one kind of sweetness that we get from a fruit or a seed like a strawberry versus sugar. And the majority of sugar that we consume in our diet is processed sugar. And so that affects the pH in our blood. And so that sugar content can be said to be the pH of sweetness. And so what happens, of course, is that in an unhealthy situation, the DNA stretches out. And so by stretching out, it increases the field size and changes the interconnection of the energy flow. It changes the positioning. It's as if Earth energy was suddenly to increase from its orbital path and impose on Mars' orbital path. Wouldn't things be different? Well, yeah, they would, but in terms of our cells, they become unhealthy. And so they're not using the oxygen the way it's intended. And so this is very important when we look at the periodic table of elements and we see the specific Gantt details of our Earth space, where we have the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen, which forms our amino acids. And then we have the environment, which is our sodium, potassium, magnesium, or calcium salts. And our residence is the Earth, and its main element is silicon. And then we have these things that affect our emotion. So the iron in our blood, the copper in our muscles, and the zinc in our emotions. So when we look at the periodic table and we see these elements are based on a sequencing, but they're all hydrogen. We just call them carbon for convenience. Instead of saying hydrogen 6, we call it nitrogen instead of saying hydrogen 7. And the same with oxygen 8. So this just seems to be like an arithmetic sequencing of integers. But when you put them together in a star formation, we can see that the basis of the star is the three fields coming together of the carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen. And then the fourth one being the hydrogen at the top of the star. This is the amino star. And so we find that the field strength of each position, and each one being a maggrav. And so we can see clearly that each maggrav is different. And that affects the positioning. So if we look at the oxygen and we say, well, that's hydrogen 8, and hydrogen is a combination of electron and proton and the interaction there form. So we understand that water includes hydrogen and oxygen. Well, wait a second, we already had the hydrogen in the oxygen. So in order to become water, we have to add more hydrogen. And so we see that there's a balance between the two hydrogens and the oxygen. So when we have a balance of magnetical gravitational field, we call that a maggrav, but clearly this is not in balance. So the structure of the water molecule really cannot exist on its own this way. It has to work as a team together. And so we look at the oxygen and how it's created with all these hydrogens, and then we add 2 more hydrogens. And we create this oxygen GANS. So this is the energy. But, you know, when you look at the gravitational and magnetical field forces, you find that, well, that doesn't look very balanced, doesn't look very stable. So quite honestly, we have to look at the bond. And so if we look at oxygen, and it always comes in pairs. Okay. So once you have this pair of oxygen, you have this gravitational stability. So the same is true for nitrogen. It comes in pairs. But when nitrogen hooks up with hydrogens, we find that it will hook up to maintain the stability as 3 hydrogens with nitrogen. But if we add the 3 hydrogen from one and add it to the 3 hydrogens of the other, now we have a balanced field. Now we have gravitational stability. So that's working out fine. And so CH3, which is a sugar, also has the same format and also has gravitational stability. Okay, well, this is good so far. But then we get this water molecule, and it said the water molecule is round. And so if we were trying to hook up these hydrogens the same way, we have gravitational stability because it is symmetric, but it certainly isn't even. It's got a bit of a cockeyed look to it. And so when we look at carbon dioxide, it actually has to depend on 2 other oxygens. So the carbon is at the center and the oxygens are on the outside. So that's how it maintains its gravitational stability. But the interesting thing about carbon dioxide, it's heavier than air. Well, I guess because carbon is physical and oxygen is gaseous. And so carbon dioxide is lethal in its physicality. But when we look at GANS as a plasma gas, we find that a solid is on the physical plane and the gas is on the emotional plane. And a plasma gas, which is gas as a nanosolid, is CO2 GANS, is life-giving. And this makes sense because our body is made of GANS. And so our body becomes a GANS spaceship. So this becomes very important to understand. So wait a second. So we have all of these emotional organs. Well, we understand that the brain and the heart, has an emotion, but so does the liver and obviously the reproductive system, the autonomous nervous system. It affects our cells. And of course, that all affects the electron transport system, which is this unseen communication stability that we have. So we have this plasmatic manifestation that starts from our brain and our heart. And we end up with this physical materialization of our body. And so all of this becomes a product of all of these emotional factors that we take into account. And so this is the same thing with our planet Earth. We see that we have two rotating fields in our hemispheres, and they're twin hemispheres, but they rotate in opposite directions. Yet when they come together to create this Earth space rotation, in its gravitational stability, the Earth only rotates in one way. So that is the limitation of the physical science. And so when we're looking at the principal interaction, we have to choose the equality reference point. You see, because the interaction between the sun, which has this binding energy, and the field of the Earth, which has this binding energy, the combination of the two have this gravitational stability, despite the fact that they have different field strengths. So that interaction, that principal interaction, becomes the equality reference point. So anytime we look at this dynamic transfer state, we have to see how the energy is coming, converging, comes to the point of conversion, and then diverges. So in the one way, we are seeing how this energy becomes gravitationally stable in the one direction. But then another thing happens. We have this crossover point at this point of conversion. Well, why is it there? Why is it focused in there? And the reason is because that becomes the focal point of the inertia field. And it too has to be gravitationally stable. So that point of focus, to be gravitationally stable, has to interact with the vertical energy transfer, which also is seeking to be gravitationally stable. So we have two gravitationally stable forces converging in the center. And whichever way you go through this conversion process, it retains its stability. So we see this gravitational stability is at the core, and the magnetical stability is on the outside. And the magnetical stability is stable because of the gravitational stability. So whether it's head to head or tail to tail, it still remains. And it has to have this inertia conversion in between, because like poles repel. So what's the attraction? So there has to be an opposite polarity. And so this inertia field is the conversion focal point. Well, sugar conversion involves a pole flipping. And this is very important because cells grow. Well, who gives that command? Do you go into the growth room in your house and say, okay, cells, grow? And then they grow. And then you kind of look at your watch and say, oh, this has been going on for quite a bit. And, I'm coming to the point where we're ready. So do you go back into the growth room and you say, okay, cells, stop growing? This is how we see our physicality, as being the dominant force. We don't have the skill. We don't have the knowledge. And we definitely don't have the patience to go through with this. This has to be done automatically for us. And so in order to stop and start growing, there has to be a pole flipping. And so this is done through sugar conversion. And when we are in a healthy cell position, we can create 36 ATP for every 1 molecule of glucose. Now that's a production. I would love it if I had $1 and I could make $36 out of it. That would be wealth. Well, we have a wealth. We're able to do sugar conversion at that rate. And that's why we're able to grow. But it's a controlled growth, and we have that control. And so we see that the amino chain, how it's formed when you bring the 3 together, opposite poles attract. So you can see that the poles actually have to flip around. And so 3 become the chain. But when you have a 4th one, they have to fold over. And that creates protein. This folding is virus assisted. So this is the unseen hand. And the reason that it's unseen is because the virus is in a plasmatic state. And it's doing this all the time. So if you go into the growth room and you say, okay, cells, you're going to grow now, which cells are you talking to? You have 70 trillion of them. And when are you going to talk to them? So fortunately for us, these cell growths are virus assisted. So this becomes very, very important for our existence. And that's plasmatic. But in a physical state, they become bacteria. And so we have the bacteria that facilitates growth also. And we have aerobic and anaerobic bacteria. And so the aerobic is oxygen loving and the anaerobic is devoid of oxygen. And so what happens? When we have oxygenated bacteria, we have growth. And when we have anaerobic bacteria, we have growth. But it's a different kind of growth. We call it decay. And so the bacteria that facilitates our growth with oxygen, when we stop breathing, that becomes anaerobic. And this is why if you have roadkill on the highway, unless someone comes and picks it up and shovels it away, it will just disappear on its own within 9 days because the bacteria will become anaerobic. And so it needs to be fed. And so instead of supplementing the host, it eats the host. And so we see that our cell metabolism is the same way. So we understand that our cells can be replaced. So we have damaged cells and we lose those cells and they get replaced by new cells. And that's just a normal process of existence. So that maintains our gravitational stability, but also in the same process, if we get wounded or injured, then the cell metabolism has to do the same thing. It has to take the wounded cells and eliminate them and replace them with healthy cells and then begin the growth process. And when the wounding is repaired, then that growth has to stop. And you don't have time to run to the growth room to decide, am I going to start the growing and am I going to stop the growing? Because there's this communication. And so we find that this communication is the same in our environment. So we have this environmental modification as well. And we say, is it predictable? Can you predict by the seasons, by the temperature, by the time of day, or is it a violation of man space? So you have to, when you're talking about a relationship, you have to decide which emotional relationship are we talking. So is it man space versus some space, or is it our inner space versus the physical space, or is it some space, inner space versus some space, physical space, or is it inner space versus outer space, or other outer space transmutation to some other space? So all of these affect emotional positioning. And so when we talk about our emotional position, we have to figure out and say, well, life is a gamble. Where do we place our bets? So are we just working from the plasmatic manifestation, or are we working from the physical materialization? So the answer, of course, is both, because the emotional position is manifested in the emotional presence, isn't it? And so we have to understand that if we were to have a growth, or if we were to have a tumor, in both cases, it would be a psychosomatic effect. So you can place your bets on whatever you want. And so this becomes a game. Our emotions are tugging at our hearts, right? So we have hard hearts and black hearts and faint hearts, and of course our favorite, sweethearts. And so this is a sweetheart gamble. And do you go to the casino of losers, like one-armed bandits, or do you go to a casino of winners, the plasma science? In other words, war and poverty, or peace and prosperity. You can make that choice as well. And so this is what we're trying to do. And on Tuesday, we had the 299th One Nation, One Planet, One Race for World Peace. And this weekend, yesterday, November the 11th, we had the Ambassadors Conference in London. We're here to bring the change. And now it's your chance to be part of it. So this magnetic and gravitational field forces, which we see as forces of attraction and repulsion, or shall we say convergence and divergence, is common in all of us, but we're all independent. So we're all independent variables, each and every one of us. But this is an interdependent universe. So we're all capable of reaching, each and every one of us, and go through this transformation on an emotional basis. And we can use that as the method to teach one about one nation, one planet, and one universe, and how our emotional vision can become manifest properly. So the emotional vision, of course, we see it in the physicality, but we say that physicality is what we see with our eyes, what we see with our ears, right? What we smell with our nose, and what we taste with our mouth. And so these all contribute to our emotions of vision, because this is the feedback vision. And our soul, of course, our soul is positioned at the same crossroad, and it too is feeding. Why? Because it is there as a manifestation of the plasmatic symbiosis, which created that position in the first place. So we find that our plasma emotions are something that emanates from us, and ideas come from our brain, and in the process of giving an idea, we don't remain with a hole in the head there. This is energy that we can share. And the same thing happens in our heart. When we wish something, or we have courage, we give it love, we were not creating a hole in our heart. But some people, they like to drill a hole in their forehead to open up the third eye, foregoing the fact that there's a plasmatic symbiosis that comes from the PM ticks and comes from the X-rays or comes from the gamma rays. These are all energies in motion, and they're all non-visible. So our vision becomes non-visible too. It's imagination. We see it in our mind's eye. This is the project of your vision. You see it the way you see it. And some people, they see this. We call them clairvoyant. They have the ability to see your aura, and they can interpret your aura. That is a skill. And as such, being your aura is a representation of the emotion stemming from your soul. They have the ability to see your soul. But which soul does the clairvoyant see? So some of us are familiar with what we call the roof of the earth. And we say, welcome to Tibet. But interestingly enough, when you look at the artifacts in the earth, there you find seashells. That's got to be pretty deep water to get to the top of the roof of the earth, doesn't it? So anyway, Tibet is renowned for its lamas. We have the Dalai Lama and other governing lamas and teaching lamas. And then, of course, we have Shaolin priests. And then we have the monks in their monasteries. But interestingly, there are industry monks and praying monks and medical monks. And, of course, the Shaolin monks. And we see them in Japan the same as the noble samurai, or that we have the warrior monks. And again, we see they're like ninja assassins. And so it's kind of strange to understand the nature of a warrior monk, but each monastery has its function. So, but there's another type of monk, and we call them beggars, and some are on the roadsides. And what's interesting about them is some of these beggars need to take. That's why they're beggars. But there are beggars that need to allow others to give. These beggars are well off because they're providing a service, you see. So some need to join a monastery to have a place to sleep and stay safely, where others have to navigate around highway bandits. And so becoming a beggar is for the elevation of your soul. The soul of man, that's the essential you. That's how you interact between the plasmagen state and the mattergen state. So when we look at the soul of the body, well, that's actually the surrogate you. That's the interaction between the plasmagen state and the environment state, the small lamb matter state. So our dreamscape elevation has to do with magnetic stability as opposed to gravitational stability. So when we're looking at the emotion of vision, that becomes the product of the emotional position and the emotional presence. And where those two come is our point of vision. And so our point of vision becomes the product and becomes the feeder and the feedback to our emotion of vision. And so the earth also has a dreamscape point of vision. That's the peace dome. And the peace dome can give and take energy. And we have a cell. It is structured just like the earth's peace dome, and it can give and take energy. So the question becomes, what is the source of your inspiration? Because all of this has the same dreamscape point of vision as the universal community. So you want to follow the leader? But who does the leader follow? Well, that's where the emotion of knowledge has to come in, you see, because when we're looking at our sentimental piece of pie in the sky, we have our soul and we trying to understand our source and our link to that, right? And so all we see is as a sentimental piece of pie in the sky. But what about the rest of the pie? So you need the rest of the pie to be fed. And once you have this feeding link, then you can have a feedback link. And so the feeding link goes to the feedback link, which goes back to the feeding link, which in turn becomes another feedback link, feeding back to the feedback link. And so it goes. And all of this is following the magnetical gravitational relationships. And so there's a link in between. And that's what creates the balance. But it's a two-way street and it's always in motion, right? And so the motion is manifest in our emotion, the emotion of man, the emotion of physicality. So we talked about the emotion of presence and how it affects our emotion of position. And that is actually reflected by our emotion of vision, whichever direction we're looking at. But if we're looking at the source of that vision, that comes via the emotion of knowledge. Because when you were born, you didn't have a brain. You started with the heart. So when we talk about intelligence, you know, we have this range between the ignorant and the knowledgeable, the uneducated or the professor, the stupid or the wise. So this emotion of knowledge, was that intelligence feeding or was it memory feedback? Well, the way we understand memory is that we have amnesia. So where do we learn this language from? Was it from thought? Was it from the alphabet? Did we have this kind of communication? And then what about declensions? They change the form of the word, don't they? And then, of course, there's translation and there's many scholars. And then, of course, there's Babylon, which is 9 civilizations piled up on each other, which you wonder if they were all the same language. So where did the language come from? So when we look at the vowels in the language, we have A, E, I, O, and U, and sometimes R, but they really stem from inflection. Ah, E, O, U, Ra. And interestingly enough, in the Oriental languages, you have the same word. By changing the inflection, you change the meaning. And if you don't understand that, it could put you in an embarrassing situation. So in the Tibetan Buddhism, which we talked about at the roof of the earth, you know, they have this chanting, Om Mane Padme Hum. But, you know, they keep repeating it. And every time they repeat it, it's not the same, is it? It builds up, and it builds up. And so this point of chanting is to put them on the path of life with intention and wisdom so they can achieve the pure body, the speech and mind of a Buddha. Well, that's great. But what about babies? You know, they had this goo goo gaga baby talk. I think monkeys have the same type. And then horizontal people may growl or bark. Vertical people, well, they communicate differently. They have secretions, right? So if you are nibbling on a plant, it'll secrete tannin and cause you indigestion. So you better move on. And then, of course, there's insects, and they have this buzzing, and each of them have this kind of unique buzzing. So that's one way they can home in on their home. But what about protozoa? What do they say? They're only single-cell organisms. So there has to be some kind of plasmatic communication. So is this an emotional feeding or is it a memory feedback? And say, well, you know, how smart are they? Do they have a brain, or is it the emotional knowledge? And so the same thing happens, you know, us as humans, we often refer to our mentors. So as a player, you have a coach, or as a student, you have a teacher. Child has a parent, or an apprentice has a master. But what happens when you're the last man standing? Who's your mentor? Uh-oh. That's a good question, isn't it? Oh, I don't know. Well, there has to be some kind of knowledge transfer. So we find that the emotion is energy, and that energy is a charge in motion, and it conveys knowledge. So that's intelligence in motion. So the motion is a byproduct of the feeding process, and the memory is a byproduct of the feedback process. But if you don't have a brain, how can you feed back? You know, because if the heart is the first thing, and it does that without a brain, no brain is no memory. So what exactly are you feeding back? And you have to feed back because you'll never get the brain. So we find this knowledge comes in flavors. We have a broad spectrum of knowledge, which comes from a broad spectrum of emotions. And all of them are feeding and contributing to gravitational stability. Excuse me. So this knowledge is in motion. And you have a choice to take what you need or give what you don't need. So you absorb what you need to enhance your soul. And you admit to enhance other souls. Which souls? The soul family. Which family is that? The sun space family, the Milky Way family, solar system family, planetary family, or the lunar family? Maybe just that in-between space family. How about our Earth space family? Sure, that's a good one, because that family is our man space point of view. So other than our man space point of view is the soul space point of view. So our knowledge on the man space point of view comes together with the amalgamation of the emotion of man, physicality, presence, position, and vision. And this is added to the soul space point of view, which is all about the emotion of knowledge. And so when you're looking at a common purpose of a family, you know, it's like birds will flock, or vertical people will come in a crop. Or is it a gang, when we call it a herd or a species? Or is it a team, like a school or a breed? Or maybe it's a band, like a group or a culture. Or is it friendship, strong friends, or through association? Or is it party politics? You know, where you have nations, or liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, or you have New Reform, or the Republicans in name only, or the pity party. Or are we all part of the Earth Party? And so we're all variable. Well, what about the marriage family? Is that genetic or is it emotional? Or is it competition or is it cooperation? What about elements? What kind of families do they have? So we have isotopes of family of elements, where the atomic number is a stable number of protons, and the number of electrons equals the number of protons. And the stable number of neutrons equals the number of protons. So the number of neutrons varies more or less than stable number in an isotope. So the isotopes are considered unstable, right? So the stable isotopes, however, identify as families. So we find that carbon-12 is a stable family, and carbon-13 and carbon-14 is the isotope. But the common mass number is not a family. So in other words, carbon-14 isotope and oxygen-14 isotope is the same as nitrogen-14, which is a stable family. So we can see how we can pick our family. So is it a genetic family? Is the family only related to parents and children, or just your children, or just your parents, or is it extended family? Or what happens if you have part-time lovers or adopted children? Is it just genetic family? But, if we are part of this biological family and say, well, our children are an offspring and of the basic family, and the basic family is created from the in-laws, which are part of that family. So there is a genetic investment in that biological family. But, if there's a divorce, then, and there's a remarriage, then that kind of changes the physical family, doesn't it? And if that changes further and has another offspring from that extended family, then there's a question, is it's not genetic or it's not physical, but maybe it's emotional. But, what about the human family? Because we're a species. So we have vertical and horizontal families, genetic families. We even have genetically modified families. And so when we look at these families, we see there's a maternal RNA. Well, there's also a paternal RNA. So if we look at racial families, okay, well, let's say I could be born in England and living in Canada, so I have the same language, different accent. But I could be born in Africa, living in Canada, maybe I'd have a different language. Or I could have an interracial father born in Canada, so that would be a different culture. Or I could have interracial parents born in Canada, and that would be different genetics. So the family connections genetically have to do with the maternal RNA. That is the common denominator. And the emotion facilitates the marriage. But the soul determines the species. So which family criteria decides? This becomes the question. And so in our pursuit of happiness, we've lost in space, because our emotion of position is based on the failure of our vision. And we think we've been in space. Yes, we have, but we've never been in outer space. Man has never launched a rocket into outer space because that's physically impossible. So we know that 100% of the souls that were born on this planet preferred the emotion of knowledge as opposed to the street smarts, right? We came here for a reason. We didn't have to adapt to war and the crime rate here until after we got here. So we came here because of our dream memory. And so when we have two forces that come together, there are factors. They come together in time. Okay. So then there's a relationship between the PM ticks, which carry this emotion of knowledge, and other PM ticks, which carry a different flavor. And as they come together, we find there's no such thing as one and the same energy, because they constitute a charge at two adjacent increments of time, but they're not one and the same. And so this is the embodiment of the principles of flow and connection. So we have to understand that when these two forces come together, they come together over a distance, and we don't know the direction that they come. So there's distance positioning and time positioning. And we have multiple points of view. So we see there's a flash or a glow. Maybe it's profitable, or maybe it's confidence in losing. Or lack of confidence in creation, or a lack of gravitational stability, because we're either deciding to account for or discount for. And as such, sometimes we create a blast, or we create bountifulness, or we create a genetic defect. Oh, so many points of view. So they come from these math anomalies. You know, when we add things together, like 1 + 1, it comes to more than 2. And we have other math functions like multiplication. And if we take 1 times 1, well, that only equals 1. And when we divide 1 by 1, it still equals 1. Well, that's kind of strange, isn't it? Did you ever wonder about that? So if we understand that we have 2 feeding dimensions, and the third one is the feedback dimension, and so we're the observer, we're the 4th dimension. Okay, well, this is pretty cool. So let's see how that affects things. So what we're looking at is the inertia manifestation when 2 forces come together. So we take into considerations the distance positioning. And if you're going to do that, then you have to compare that to 2. And then we're going to take into consideration the time positioning. So in order to do that, you have to look at 2. Okay, so now we're starting to involve other things. And so this inertia manifestation becomes a manifestation of a kind. And it all has to do with the magnetical feeding of the PM ticks. And each of them come together as an energy pack and converge into principal field, transition field, and a convergence field. So that creates the gravitational maggraph. But that has to have an interaction with the environment. And that has to have a feedback from that environment. So that becomes a field interaction of one maggrav with another maggrav. And that field interaction is the inertia manifestation. And because it's conditional on the positioning and it's conditional on the distance and the time, then that becomes a variable. So let's take that into account. We have to look at these variables. So we see if we were to add 1 + 1, and we said it's more than 2, which means if we add another one, it's still going to be more than 2. We can keep adding more and there'll always be more than 2. But if we multiply and add another one, so 1 times 1 is 1 times 1 is 1, it remains the same. And then if we do the division, 1 divided by 1 divided by 1, it still equals 1. Wait a second, something's not quite right here. So the first one is fine, because every time you bring all these fields together, it's always more than the combination of 2. But if we were to take one product and just look at that 1 and say 1 times 1, and take the product of that times 1, it's still 1. And then if we divide, it's the same. Well, what about the other one? Let's just, reverse this. Let's take 1 times the product of 1 times 1. Well, it still comes up to 1. And if we divide, the same still happens. So there's something funny going on here. So we have to look at the core component, and we find that the electron-proton marriage creates these gravitational rays. That's part of the atomic marriage. But what we have to see is that they're magnetical PM ticks, and we have to decide, is it plasmatic or is it physical? And then understand that the physical is in the background and the plasmatic is in the foreground. So you, as the observer, now you can say, well, if I add these 3 fields together, I will have more than 3. Okay, because I'm none of those 3. So, but the fact that you exist is more than 3. But if we multiply, and these are all 3 different fields now, they still come out to 1. And we can see that. And then if we divide these fields, they still come out to 1. So is the multiplied 1 and the divided 1 the same 1? Well, no, they're not, because they are affected by time and distance and positioning. What you're looking at, these inertia fields, right? That's what they are. And you're the observer of these inertia fields. So the inertia of relations has to do with accommodating the strength of the field by the relationships. And the higher strength feeds the lower space. So there's an earth space, which is a kind of energy state, and it is gravitationally stable. But there's an inner space, and it too is gravitationally stable. And it is bound to the ethos of the universe. So now we have to take into consideration the synergy fields, where we see that we add all these come together in a gravitationally stable part of the star formation. But when we look at the creation dimension and the decay dimension, which are part of the creation, that becomes the completion of the star formation. And so they all work together in a maggrav condition. To understand this in more layman's terms, if we look at a soccer game and we see that there's 2 teams, there's one team on one side, one team on the other side, and clearly they're not the same team. We don't even know if they're professional or amateur, but does it matter? No, because there's a third team, and it's the observer team, the fans in the audience, right? But when we play this game, we have players. So the players are part of the team. But when we look at the other fields on the field, we find that there's a back part of the field, a middle part, and a front part. There's also a left part, center part, and a right part. And then there's a combination of it all. So really, a soccer game is a bunch of mini games. So where we have on one side, we have the left back, and he has a game from the player from the other team, who is the right front. So conversely, the left back of the other team has a mini game with your right front. And so we see clearly that there's a bunch of mini games. But there's another team, and that's the audience. And there's more than 2. In fact, there's a lot of us. There's a lot more. Sometimes there may be 100,000 people in a stadium watching this game, and there's still only 2 teams. So the number of teams and the number of spectators are not fixed. So the game is the soul of inertia, because the soul of the game has to take into account all of these souls. And so that is a demonstration of the soul sequencing, which is mandatory, where we have the soul of the sun plus the soul of the earth. This attracts the soul of the man. That's an attraction point of convergence. But we have to have a priority, and that is the soul of the solar system plus the soul of the sun attracts the soul of the earth. That too is a point of convergence. And if the soul of the earth and the soul of the sun attracts the earth body, then now we've gone through an inversion where we have the soul and the earth body and the soul of the earth body. Well, now we can attract the soul of the man body, because the soul of the man interacts with the soul of the earth body and goes through the same inversion. But before we can materialize, the soul of the sun body plus the soul of the earth body has to manifest the physicality of the earth, which is materialization. So once we have that, then the soul of the earth plus the soul of the body can manifest the physicality of the body. And that also is materialization. So the materialization of the man space has to have a place. And that place, in this case, is our earth space. And our earth space got here from the same emotion of knowledge that we did. And so we find that the manifestation of the peace dome is the soul of inertia. And that soul of inertia is not only in the earth space, it's in our cell souls, and it also is part of the universal community. So this becomes a community, soul, family reference. And so the question is, what is the source of your inspiration? And so the dream memory is really what it comes from, because if we look at the gravitational field effect, which is the materialization effect, where the heart materialization precedes the brain and the blood materialization is throughout the body but around the brain, the question becomes, can the brain materialization precede the heart? Well, let's look at our dream memory. Note to self: make daily plans, review daily progress, go to sleep, remember your dream, and try again in the morning. So really, you have to dare to dream, because sometimes we don't do it in our sleep. Sometimes we do it through pondering, right? So we have to dare to dream big. And we have a basic instinct, right? That's how we got here in the first place, wasn't it? Because we already did dare to dream big. That was part of the emotion of knowledge, because that was in our DNA dream. We had to remember our DNA dream because we have to make daily growth plans. We have to review daily growth progress, and then go to sleep, remember our DNA dream, and then try it again in the morning. And then we have to dare to dream bigger, right? Because we're born as babies and we grow into adults. And so we see the same thing with snails, and there are different kinds of snails. Some have smooth shells, some have pointy shells, and you know, the growth is in all three dimensions. And the snail is not in any of those dimensions. It's inside the shell. Hello. So when we look at how things grow, we can compare the structure of the nerves versus the structure of fatty acids, and also the structure of the nanomonatomic particles that we have. And then when we compare, we have the stacker unit, and we also have our skeleton, and which is kind of physical. And when we see the x-ray, we only see the skeleton. Where's the rest of the stuff? And then some of the horizontal people, let's say like a moose, where the skeleton actually comes right out of the head. That's above the head. And so we see a similarity in the structure, where the myelin sheath of the nerves looks like a stacker formation of the cups of life, looks like the spine of the skeleton. And so we have these boundaries where we have this collective amnesia, where we can't remember at birth. And yet our RNA and DNA seems to remember this, no problem. And so we have this collective growth. And we have another point, which is death. We can't remember after death. So then we have this relationship with our DNA and RNA. It seems to understand this. So when we're looking at our brain and we look at the things that we can remember with our brain, but we were born before we had the brain function. So it was thanks to our sweetheart that it could remember this connection. And the same thing happens when we do the sleep. So we dream with the soul, and the soul makes the connection with other souls, the soul family. So everything else is posturing. So is it offensive? Then, as in attacking, or is it defensive, as in defending? Or is it advancement, as in progression? Are you a provider, or are you a denier? Are you defensive, as in preventing regression? Or are you offensive in offering peace and prosperity? So the biosphere of peace facilitates the emotion of position, and the vertical people have their own dreamscape. And so the majority seek and will answer the call for freedom and emancipation, because the universe is emotionally normal. The earth seeks freedom and emancipation, and man can choose his existential adaptation to the harvest of the plasma emotional energy of the plasma universe. And so we follow this emotional position map, and all it is this feedback radiance coming from a MAGRAP position to another feeding radiance of another MAGRAP position that crosses through this reality dimension, which facilitates the feedback radiance. But in the process, we have this gravitational stability of the energy binding of one and the gravitational stability of the energy binding of the other, and then the interaction of the energy between these two fields in a two-way street, and this gravitational stability of the reality dimension. So we follow that because we are inherently peaceful, you see, because in our inner space dreamscape, the earth space landscape is heaven, and the man space dreamscape is peace. And so we are here for peace on earth. That's who we are. That's why we left one place. And that's why we can see when we put the one cup together and we create this Gans, and then we create the cups of man, and we have an emotional Gans and the physical Gans, and then we have more cups coming together. We have the earth cup and the inertia cup, and then we have a different kind of Gans, and then we have the cup of soul, which each cup has a soul, and then collectively all the cups together have a magnetical gravitational field force with a soul. And so this is where we look at our solar system and we see all of us individually. And this is where science has to meet the soul of man for peace. This is how it happens. So we're in the post-December 16th era of 2022, where we make choices, and we've been going on these trips every month to explore outer space, how it's a reflection of our inner space and interaction with that bountiful space we call Earth space. And so for 511 Knowledge Seekers Workshop, which is now over a decade, where we've been trying to bring the inner oneness together to transcend the limitations of nuclear science. And so here we are at Queen Mary College in London, where it all started. What goes around comes around. And so we have to understand the difference between matter plasma that is a small m matter state, because that's the lower rate of energy transfer. And the capital M matter state, which is plasmatic, it's a higher rate of energy transfer. So you can sense it, but each of us has different rates of sensitivity, because each of us is dynamic plasma being. And when you look at this, which way is up, which way is down, which way is north, which way is east, what do you know? What's your terms of reference? So the Fourth World Ambassadors Conference is part of the revolution in science and technology. Here we are. And we're in the day after of the big reveal. And the conference is, by the time now, the conference should have been finished. And so we will be living in the new world, because the Kesh plasma has been put forward in exchange for peace. And this is the Kesh plasma token, where you can wear it anywhere you wish to have it as a symbol of the Kesh plasma science and technology offered in exchange for peace. And we are leaving the Linz exhibition behind, because we're moving from the materialization science. And so welcome to the new space age. The Kesh Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. Welcome all the beautiful knowledge seekers. Life's learning lessons. Transmute your dreamscape to your preference and sentimentality. There's a world peace treaty. Sign it. Sign it with your heart. Sign it with a pen. Sign it with emotion. And sign it with deep intention. Because all of us are here with the dilution of emotion that allows fields of life choices free from boundaries or abuse. And your ethos is your GPS positioner in the peace, on the peace roadmap, and the universal community is your travel guide. So the speed of love manifests and determines your inner space emotional construct. And the earthbound soul family seeks physical and emotional gravitational vitality. The emotion of knowledge is embodied in the transmutation connection, and it connects equally to the universal cosmic rays freedom broadcast channel, this broadcast channel of inner space. So remember your inner space dream that resonates with the proper plasma universe. Plasma science needs to continue to be delivered in exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new outer space age. And that's the end of this review, and thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed the trip. So as we said, this review is to help to distill the thousands of hours that we've accumulated in teaching over the past decade. And this review is a further distillation of the 4 years that we've been doing with these classes in the North American teaching. This doesn't count the number of classes that we've had in the private class sessions or in the public sessions that we've had in the various communities, be it the Brazilian or Italian or English or French communities, Chinese community, the Iranian community. We're probably only reaching, let's say, 5 or 6% of the population. So over 90% of the population don't know what we're talking about. And many won't give you more than 35 seconds to learn. We need to step up the game, and we have, with the new communication system. that goes beyond our inner space. And we've crossed a watershed. The way these classes have dovetailed together with current events has been a notable factor for me, because I didn't plan it this way, but it sure worked out really, really well. Because that's what we're doing now. We're elevating the souls, take them from the background, put them into the foreground, and understanding that our foreground focus of our physicality needs to gently, gracefully be put into the background. And we have to see how this is going to affect our life going forward. Because if our neighbors are sick, our community is sick. And if they're unhealthy and they can't work, they can't pay for your goods and services. And if you get sick and they're sick, they can't help you. So we're finding that we all need a little assist. And we need to change the personality on this planet. We have to become a peaceful planet, because that's the ticket to the extension of not only to the universal community family, but to understand that we came from somewhere. Wherever we came from, at one time, that was our home. So we left home to come here. And now that we're here, this is our home. But the ticket to go home, our original home, has been destroyed. This weekend, we've stamped a new ticket. Make your plans, share the knowledge with others, and let's bring peace to this planet. Does anyone have any comments? Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Really appreciate you being here. This has been one hell of an emotional ride this weekend. And it's been a pleasure, a real pleasure. And I want to thank everybody for being here, giving us the field strength of your energy and your intention. It's been my personal goal to eradicate certain health issues on this planet. And with the rollout of the new wellness centers, that dream will be fulfilled. So thank you all for being a part of this, and thank you for allowing me to present. If there are no other comments, I'd like to review our plasma units, and do the disclaimer, and bring the meeting to the end. Does anybody have any further things to add?